The apartment was too quiet. It had been quiet for exactly 63 days, but this afternoon the silence felt heavier, like a physical weight pressing against the windows. Elias stood in the spare room, the one they had never quite decided what to do with. It was supposed to be an office, or maybe a library, but mostly it had become a graveyard for things that didn't have a home. He was supposed to be clearing the top shelf of the closet. There were old tax returns, a broken lamp, and a stack of magazines from 3 years ago. Behind a pile of winter blankets that still smelled faintly of cedar and something else, something softer that made his throat tighten, he found it. A mahogany box, the wood scarred at the corners, with a simple brass latch that had lost its shine. Elias sat on the edge of the guest bed, the springs groaning under his weight. He didn't remember this box. He didn't remember Julian ever mentioning it. He traced the grain of the wood with a thumb, his pulse a slow, steady thrum in his ears. He almost put it back. He almost tucked it back behind the blankets and pretended he hadn't seen it. But his hands moved before his mind could catch up, and the latch clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the empty hallway. Inside, there were envelopes. Dozens of them. None of them had stamps. None of them had addresses. They were all marked with a single name in Julian's looping, elegant script, Elias. He took a breath, the air cold in his lungs, and pulled out the first one. Dear Elias, I am writing this because you are currently asleep 3 feet away from me, and I feel like if I wake you up to say these things, you'll look at me with that polite, distant expression that makes me feel like I'm a stranger asking for directions. We've been together for 4 months today. You forgot, which is fine. I told myself I wouldn't be the kind of person who counts the days, but here I am, counting. I watched you tonight while we were eating dinner. You were looking at your phone, and for a second, your brow furrowed, and I wanted to reach across the table and smooth the little line between your eyes. I didn't. I stayed in my chair and ate my pasta and talked about the weather. Why is it so hard to touch you lately? When we first started, your scent was everywhere. It was like a blanket. Now, I have to lean in close just to catch a hint of it, and even then, it feels like you're holding it back. Is that possible? Can an alpha pull their scent inward so no one can reach it? I think you're doing that. I think you're pulling everything inward. I love the way your hands look when you're reading. I love the way you take your coffee. I'm terrified that I'm the only one in this room who is actually here. You're in there somewhere, Elias, but you've built such high walls. I'm going to keep these letters in this box. Maybe one day I'll give them to you. Or maybe I'll just keep them here, a little museum of the things I'm too scared to say to your face. Elias felt a sharp, cold prickle at the back of his neck. He remembered that night. It was a Tuesday. He had been stressed about the merger, his mind a hive of numbers and legal contingencies. He remembered the pasta, it had been slightly overcooked, and he remembered Julian's voice, steady and light, talking about the rain. He hadn't noticed the silence beneath the words. He hadn't noticed that Julian was reaching out with every sentence, only to be met with a wall of professional courtesy. He looked at his hands. They were the hands Julian had loved. They looked the same, but they felt heavy, clumsy. He reached for the second envelope. Subscribe for more stories of the heart. It's been 8 months now. You stayed late at the office again. I made the mistake of waiting up. When you walked through the door at 11 past midnight, you looked so tired that I felt guilty for even wanting a hello. You smelled like ozone and expensive cologne, but the underlying note, the one that belongs to you, was buried under layers of exhaustion. I asked if you wanted tea. You said no. You went straight to the shower. I sat on the sofa and listened to the water running, and I wondered if you were washing me off your skin. That's a dramatic thing to write, isn't it? I'm becoming dramatic. It's what happens when you spend too much time in your own head. I want to tell you that I got the promotion today. I'm the lead designer for the new botanical project. I wanted to open a bottle of wine and celebrate, but when I saw your face, I just felt like I was inconveniencing you with my existence. So, I'm telling this paper instead. I'm proud of myself, Elias. I wish you were too. You're so focused on being the perfect alpha, the one who provides, the one who is stable and unshakable. But I don't need a statue. I need a man. I need you to be messy. I need you to be loud. I need you to look at me and actually see me, not just the person who happens to share your zip code. I'm starting to feel like a ghost in this apartment. If I stopped talking, would you even notice the silence? Elias shifted his position on the bed, the paper crinkling in his grip. He hadn't known about the promotion. Or had he? He searched his memory, digging through the layers of self-imposed distance. He remembered Julian mentioning a project, but he had responded with a distracted "that's good" while checking an email. He hadn't looked up. He hadn't seen the light in Julian's eyes die out. A hollow ache began to bloom in the center of his chest, a slow-spreading coldness. He had thought he was being a good partner by staying out of the way, by not burdening Julian with his own stress. He had called it giving him space. The letters called it something else. They called it abandonment. He picked up the 12th letter. It was written on yellow legal pad paper, the edges torn unevenly. I'm angry today. I'm so angry I can feel it in my teeth. We had that fight about the groceries, except it wasn't about the groceries, was it? It was about the fact that you haven't touched me in 3 weeks. Not a kiss, not a hand on my shoulder, nothing. When I tried to hug you this morning, you stepped back to put on your coat. You didn't even realize you did it. It's an instinct now, isn't it? To keep me at arm's length. You said I was being sensitive. You said you were just busy. I hate that word. Busy is a choice. You are choosing to be busy so you don't have to be present. I saw the way you looked at that couple in the park yesterday, the ones who were laughing and scent-marking each other so openly it was almost embarrassing. You looked at them with such longing, Elias. For a split second, the mask slipped. You want that. I know you do. So why won't you let me give it to you? Why are you so afraid of me? I'm not a trap. I'm not a burden. I'm just the person who loves you, though God knows why lately. I wrote in my 3rd letter that I was terrified of being the only one here. Well, I'm not terrified anymore. I'm just tired. The anger is better than the fear, I think. It feels more solid. Elias turned back to the 3rd letter, laying it side by side with the 12th. In the 3rd, Julian's handwriting was light, almost tentative. In the 12th, the pen had pressed so hard into the paper it had nearly torn through. The contradiction was a physical blow. Julian had moved from hope to anger, and Elias had been so preoccupied with his own internal shadows that he hadn't even noticed the shift. He had thought they were stable. He had mistaken Julian's quiet withdrawal for contentment. He looked around the room. The dust motes danced in a shaft of late-afternoon sun, indifferent to the wreckage he was uncovering. He reached for a letter with a date at the top. November 14th. It's Tuesday. The sky is that bruised purple color you like. We went to that gallery opening tonight, and everyone kept telling me how lucky I am to have such a composed, successful alpha. I smiled and agreed. I'm a very good actor, Elias. I should get an award. During the drive home, the heater in the car was humming, and for a moment, the silence felt almost peaceful. Then you reached over and adjusted the vent so the air wouldn't hit me, and you did it without looking at me. It was such a kind, thoughtful gesture, and it broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. Because you can be thoughtful, can't you? You can be careful with me. You just can't be with me. I realized tonight that you've turned our relationship into a series of managed interactions. You schedule our dinners, you manage our conversations, you mitigate our intimacy. You're treating me like a project that needs to be completed with minimal risk. I'm 26 years old, and I feel like I'm 80. I feel like I'm waiting for the end of a long, slow illness. You're killing us, Elias. You're doing it so politely that I can't even find a reason to scream. Elias closed his eyes. November 14th. He remembered that night. He had been proud of himself for making it to the gallery. He had been exhausted, his head throbbing with a tension headache, but he had gone because he knew it mattered to Julian. He had adjusted the vent because he knew Julian hated the dry air on his face. He had thought it was a moment of connection. He hadn't realized that his refusal to look at Julian had turned a gesture of care into an act of clinical management. He was a surgeon who had forgotten the patient was awake on the table. He felt a sudden, sharp need to breathe, his lungs refusing to expand. He grabbed another letter, this one written on the back of a receipt. I wasn't going to write tonight. I told myself I was done with this box. But then you came home and you had bought those lilies I like. The white ones. You put them in the vase and you didn't say anything, you just squeezed my hand for 2 seconds and went to your study. Why do you do that? Why do you give me just enough to keep me from leaving, but never enough to make me stay? It's cruel, Elias. It's the cruelest thing you've ever done. If you don't want me, let me go. If you're bored, or if you've realized that I'm not what you wanted, just say it. I can handle the truth. I can't handle this slow-motion starvation. I'm hungry for you. I'm starving for a version of you that doesn't exist anymore. I keep looking for him in the hallway, in the kitchen, in our bed. But he's gone, and he's been replaced by this man who was so terrified of being hurt that he's decided to stop feeling altogether. Well, congratulations. You're safe. No one can hurt you if you aren't there. But you're losing me. You're losing me an inch at a time, and you don't even seem to care. Elias let the receipt flutter to the floor. He cared. That was the irony that felt like a hot blade in his gut. He had cared so much that the mere thought of Julian leaving, or of Julian being disappointed in him, had paralyzed him. He had been so convinced that if he showed his true, messy, anxious self, Julian would realize he had made a mistake. So he had polished himself. He had refined his edges. He had become a version of himself that was impossible to wound, and in doing so, he had become impossible to love. He had been so efficient at protecting the relationship that he had strangled the life out of it. He reached for the next letter. It ended with a question. Do you actually like me, Elias? I'm not asking if you love me, I know you do, in your own way. I'm asking if you like the person I am when I'm not being your omega. Do you like my jokes? Do you like the way I argue about movies? Or am I just a role you're playing opposite of? Sometimes I think if I were replaced by a different person with the same scent, you wouldn't notice for a month. Tell me I'm wrong. Please. Just once, tell me I'm wrong without using that calm, reasonable voice. Scream at me. Tell me I'm being a brat. Just be real. Elias hadn't answered. He hadn't even known the question was being asked. He had thought his calm, reasonable voice was a sign of maturity, a gift he was giving to Julian to keep their home peaceful. Instead, it had been a gag, a way to silence the friction that makes a relationship grow. He felt a drop of moisture hit the back of his hand. He didn't realize he was crying until he saw the dark circle on the mahogany box. He didn't wipe his eyes. He let the tears fall, a slow, quiet rain that had been delayed for years. He reached for the last few letters. They were shorter now. The handwriting was different, steadier, colder. I've decided. I'm not going to tell you tonight. I'm going to wait until Sunday. You like Sundays. They're predictable. I don't want to ruin your work week. Isn't that funny? Even now, I'm managing your schedule for you. I'm leaving, Elias. Not because I don't love you. I'm leaving because I love myself more than I love the ghost you've turned me into. I want to live in a house where people touch each other. I want to be with someone who isn't afraid of the dark. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for in all that silence. I hope it's worth it. And then, the final letter. It was written on a plain piece of white paper. No date. No greeting. The lavender is blooming on the balcony. I watered it this morning. There's some leftover soup in the fridge, make sure you heat it up properly, don't just eat it cold like you usually do. I took the blue mug, the one with the chipped handle. I hope you don't mind. It's my favorite. Be well, Elias. Try to breathe every once in a while. The world won't fall apart if you let your guard down. That was it. The ordinariness of it was what finally broke him. No grand accusations. No final plea. Just instructions for soup and a mention of a chipped mug. Julian had checked out so completely that he was worried about Elias's nutrition. The distance Elias had built had become a canyon, and Julian had simply walked to the other side and started a new life. Elias sat in the fading light for an hour, the letters scattered around him like fallen leaves. He felt the weight of every missed opportunity, every silenced word, every withheld touch. He had been so afraid of losing Julian that he had made losing him inevitable. He stood up, his legs stiff. He didn't put the letters back in the box. He gathered them up, carefully, and walked to the kitchen. He saw the empty spot on the shelf where the blue mug used to be. He hadn't even realized it was gone. He picked up his phone. His fingers hovered over Julian's name. It had been 63 days. He didn't call. He couldn't. Not yet. He had to earn the right to speak to him again. He had to become the man who could answer those letters. 6 months later, the air was crisp with the arrival of autumn. Elias sat in a small, crowded coffee shop, his hands wrapped around a paper cup. He was nervous. Not the cold, paralyzing nervousness of the past, but a buzzing, alive feeling that made his skin tingle. The door opened, a bell chiming, and Julian walked in. He looked good. His hair was a little longer, his coat a deep forest green that made his eyes pop. He saw Elias and paused, his expression unreadable. Then, he walked over and sat down. "You look different," Julian said. His voice was the same warm, melodic, but there was a new edge to it, a layer of protection that hadn't been there before. "I've been practicing," Elias said. It was a strange thing to say, but it was the truth. "Practicing what?" "Being here. Not in my head. Not in the future. Just here." Julian watched him for a long moment. "I got your message. You said you wanted to explain." "I found the box," Elias said quietly. Julian flinched. It was a small movement, but Elias saw it. "You weren't supposed to find those." "I know. But I'm glad I did. I read every single one. I read them all in one afternoon, and then I read them again every night for a month." "Why?" "Because I didn't know the person who wrote them," Elias said, his voice cracking. "I thought I knew you, Julian. I thought I was protecting you. But I was just protecting myself. I was afraid that if I let you see how much I needed you, you'd have the power to destroy me. So I made sure I was already destroyed before you could even try. I was a coward. I pushed you away systematically because I was terrified of what wanting you that much would do to me. I'm so sorry. I'm not saying this to get you back. I'm saying it because you deserved to hear it years ago." Julian leaned back, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over Elias's shoulder. "I knew," he said softly. "I figured it out about a month after I left. I had a lot of time to think. I realized that you weren't cold because you didn't care. You were cold because you were freezing. But Elias, knowing why someone is hurting you doesn't make it hurt any less." "I know," Elias said. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to have the truth. You spent so long wondering if it was you. It was never you. It was always me." They sat in silence for a long time. The coffee shop hummed around them, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of voices, the clink of spoons. It was the kind of noise Elias used to find distracting. Now, he welcomed it. It was the sound of life happening. "The apology is good," Julian said finally. "I needed to hear it. But I don't know what to do with the rest of it. I've built a life, Elias. It's a quiet life, but it's mine. I don't know if I have room for a version of you that actually shows up." "Then let me be a ghost for a while longer," Elias said. "Let me prove it. No pressure. No management. Just, let me try." Julian looked at him then, really looked at him. He saw the dark circles under Elias's eyes, the way his shoulders were no longer held with rigid perfection. He saw the man, not the statue. "Okay," Julian whispered. "We can try coffee. Just coffee." It took months. There was nothing automatic about it. They met once a week, then twice. Elias had to learn how to speak his feelings in real time, a process that felt like learning a foreign language while standing on a stage. He would feel the old impulse to withdraw, the cold wave of fear that told him to shut down and be reasonable, and he would force himself to stay. He would name the feeling. "I'm feeling overwhelmed right now," he would say, his voice shaking. "I'm afraid I'm saying the wrong thing." And Julian would listen. He wouldn't fix it. He would just stay on his side of the table and let Elias be messy. It was the hardest thing Elias had ever done. It was also the only thing that had ever made him feel truly alive. One evening, 3 months into their trying, they were walking through the park. The same park where Julian had seen the happy couple all those years ago. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. "I have something to tell you," Julian said. He stopped walking and turned to face Elias. His scent was different, sharper, more complex. Elias felt a sudden, instinctive flare in his own scent, a protective, grounding note he hadn't felt in years. "What is it?" Elias asked. He didn't move away. He stayed close, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I'm pregnant," Julian said. The world seemed to tilt. For a split second, the old Elias, the one who managed risks and calculated contingencies, screamed in the back of his mind. This is too much. This is too fast. You aren't ready. You'll fail. You'll hurt him again, but Elias didn't listen. He took a breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and he reached out. He took Julian's hands in his. They were cold, trembling. "I'm here," Elias said. "Elias." "I'm not going to tell you it'll be perfect," Elias interrupted, his voice steady. "I'm not going to tell you I won't be scared. I am scared. I'm terrified. But I'm here. Right now, in this second, I am staying. And I will stay in the next second, too." Julian let out a breath that was half sob, half laugh. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against Elias's chest. For the first time in years, Elias didn't pull back. He wrapped his arms around Julian, burying his face in the crook of his neck, breathing in the scent of the man he had almost lost to his own silence. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were still walls to tear down, still habits to break. But the distance was gone. There was only the heat of another person, the weight of a shared future, and the quiet, devastating honesty of two people who had finally stopped running. Later that night, after he had dropped Julian off at his apartment with a promise to call in the morning, Elias sat at his desk. He took out a piece of paper and a pen. He thought about the mahogany box, still sitting on the guest bed. He thought about the 41 letters he had read. He began to write. "Dear Julian, I'm writing this because I'm currently sitting in my kitchen and the silence doesn't feel heavy anymore. It feels like a space we're filling together. I realized today that the thing I was most afraid of losing, you, was already lost because I kept letting go of you. I won't let go again. I'm still learning how to be the man you deserve, but I'm not doing it in secret anymore. I'm doing it with you. Thank you for the soup. Thank you for the blue mug. Thank you for staying long enough to leave, so I could finally learn how to follow." He folded the paper and put it in an envelope. He didn't put it in a box. He put it in his pocket. He would give it to Julian tomorrow. Because the things we say are important, but the things we do are the only things that stay. And Elias was staying. He was finally, truly staying. The letters had been a roadmap through a ghost town, a guide to a relationship that had died of neglect. But they had also been a seed. From the wreckage of Julian's unsent honesty, something new was growing, something sturdier, something that could withstand the wind. Elias looked at the mahogany box one last time before closing the door to the spare room. He didn't need it anymore. He had the person. He had the voice. He had the messy, beautiful, terrifying reality of a love that was no longer managed, but lived. In the months that followed, the transition was not seamless. There were days when Elias felt the cold shadow of his old self creeping back, days when Julian's trust wavered like a candle in a draft. But they had a new language now. They had the letters as a reminder of what happens when the words go unsaid. Whenever Elias felt himself pulling away, he would remember the letter about the gallery opening, the one where Julian felt like a ghost. He would remember the receipt with the lilies. And he would reach out. He would touch Julian's hand, or he would say something true, even if it was small. "I'm having a hard day," he would admit over dinner. "I know," Julian would reply, reaching across the table. "Me too." And that was enough. The shared acknowledgement of the struggle was the bridge they had been missing. When the baby arrived, a small, loud alpha with Julian's eyes and Elias's stubborn chin, the house was no longer quiet. It was filled with the sounds of a life that was being lived at full volume. There were broken dishes and sleepless nights and arguments about diapers. There was the smell of baby powder and milk and the deep, grounding scent of two parents who were finally, fully present. Elias kept one thing from the mahogany box. Not a letter, but the small piece of paper he had written to himself at 3 a.m, months after Julian had left. It sat in the back of his wallet, a hidden talisman. Asterisk, the thing you're afraid of losing is already lost because you keep letting go of it. Stayed asterisk, he didn't need to read it often, but he liked knowing it was there. It was a reminder of the man he used to be, and the man he had fought to become. One afternoon, while the baby was napping, Julian found Elias sitting on the balcony, looking out at the city. The lavender was blooming again, its purple spikes swaying in the breeze. Julian sat down beside him, leaning his head on Elias's shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" Julian asked. Elias smiled, a genuine, easy expression that reached his eyes. He reached over and took Julian's hand, lacing their fingers together. "I was thinking about the soup," Elias said. "The soup?" "The soup in the last letter." "You were right. I used to eat it cold. It's much better when it's warm." Julian laughed, a bright, clear sound that filled the air. "I told you so." "You did," Elias said, pulling him closer. "You told me a lot of things. I'm just glad I finally learned how to listen." They sat there for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky turning that bruised purple color they both loved. There were no letters tonight. There was no need for them. Everything that needed to be said was being said in the way their hands held each other, in the way their breaths synced up in the cooling air, in the way they both chose, every single second, to stay. The box was empty, the shadows were gone, and the distance had finally, mercifully, been closed. Elias felt the warmth of Julian's body against his, a constant, living reminder of what he had almost thrown away. He thought about the systematic way he had pushed him away, the clinical precision of his withdrawal. It felt like a lifetime ago. It felt like a story about someone else. He was no longer the architect of his own loneliness. He was a man who knew the value of a chipped mug and a bowl of warm soup. He was a man who knew that the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't being hurt, it was being alone while someone was standing right next to you. "I love you," Elias said. He didn't say it because it was expected. He didn't say it to manage the moment. He said it because it was the truth, and because the truth was the only thing that could keep them whole. Julian squeezed his hand. "I know," he said. "I've always known. I'm just glad you finally know it too." The silence of the apartment was gone, replaced by the quiet, steady heartbeat of a family. It wasn't the silence of things unsaid, but the peace of things understood. And as the stars began to poke through the purple haze of the evening, Elias realized that the most important letter he would ever write wasn't on paper. It was the life he was building, one honest, messy, beautiful day at a time. He was here. He was staying. And that was the only confession that mattered. Elias looked at the lavender, its scent mingling with the evening air. It was a simple plant, but it had survived the winter. It had bloomed again, just like they had. He thought about the mahogany box, now tucked away in the back of the closet, no longer a tomb but a foundation. Every letter in that box had been a cry for help, a plea for connection, a map of a breaking heart. He had read them all, and in doing so, he had learned how to read Julian. He had learned the language of the things Julian didn't say. He had learned that a sigh wasn't just a breath, but a weight being carried. He had learned that a smile could be a shield, and that silence could be a scream. He wouldn't forget. He wouldn't let the walls go back up. He would keep the windows open, even when the wind was cold. He would keep the doors unlocked, even when he was afraid. Because he knew now that the only way to keep what you love is to be willing to lose it every single day. You have to show up, fully and without armor, and trust that the other person will do the same. Julian shifted beside him, his breath evening out as he drifted into a light doze. Elias watched him, the way the moonlight caught the curve of his cheek, the way his hand remained firmly tucked into Elias's own. This was it. This was the reality he had been so afraid of. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't a burden. It was simply the most precious thing he had ever held. He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to Julian's temple, the scent of lavender and home filling his senses. "Thank you for the letters," he whispered into the quiet night. There was no reply, only the steady rhythm of Julian's breathing. But Elias didn't need a reply. He had everything he needed right here. The distance he had made had been long and treacherous, but it had led him back to the only place he ever wanted to be. He was home. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't planning his exit. He was just breathing. As the night deepened, Elias found himself reflecting on the nature of the letters. They were more than just paper and ink, they were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, or rather, the Omega spirit. Julian had endured so much in silence, yet he had never truly given up on the hope that Elias would one day find his way back. The letters were a bridge that Julian had built, one plank at a time, even as Elias was trying to tear the whole structure down. It was a miracle that the bridge had held. He thought about the contradicting letter 12. How Julian had been so furious, so certain that he was done, yet he had stayed for months after. It showed the complexity of love, the way it's never a straight line from I love you to I'm leaving. It's a jagged, messy thing, full of U-turns and dead ends. Julian had struggled with himself as much as he had struggled with Elias. He had fought his own desire to stay, his own hope that things would change. And in the end, it was that very hope that had saved them both. Elias resolved to never let that hope be in vain again. He would be the Alpha Julian had written to in those early letters, the one who was funny, and kind, and present. He would be the man who didn't just provide a house, but a home. He would be the one who noticed the chipped mug and the blooming lavender and the way Julian's scent changed when he was happy. He would be the one who didn't just listen, but heard. The next morning, the sun broke through the curtains, painting stripes of gold across the bed. Elias woke up first, watching Julian sleep. The baby was starting to stir in the next room, a soft, rhythmic grunting that signaled he would be awake soon. Elias felt a surge of warmth in his chest, a feeling so strong it was almost painful. He didn't pull away from it. He leaned into it, letting it wash over him. When Julian finally blinked his eyes open, he saw Elias watching him. He didn't look surprised. He just smiled, a sleepy, contented smile that made Elias's heart skip a beat. "Hey," Julian whispered. "Hey," Elias replied. "You're still here." "I'm still here." Julian reached out and tangled his fingers in Elias's hair. "Good. Don't go anywhere." "I'm not," Elias said, leaning down to kiss him. "I'm right where I'm supposed to be." And as the baby's first cry echoed through the hallway, Elias stood up. He didn't feel the weight of responsibility as a burden. He felt it as a privilege. He walked toward the sound, his steps sure and steady. He was no longer the man who lived in the distance. He was the man who had closed it. And as he picked up his son, he knew that the letters in the mahogany box were no longer the most important words in his life. The most important words were the ones he was saying now, with his actions, with his presence, and with his heart. He carried the baby back into the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed next to Julian. They looked at their son, a perfect blend of both of them. He was the future they had almost missed out on. He was the evidence that even the deepest distance can be crossed if you're willing to walk the path. He has your nose, Julian remarked, poking the baby's tiny snout. And your stubbornness, Elias added, laughing. We're in trouble then, Julian teased. Maybe, Elias said, pulling Julian close. But it's the best kind of trouble. They sat there for a long time, a quiet, happy family in the morning light. The mahogany box was forgotten, its contents finally integrated into the fabric of their lives. The letters were no longer secrets, they were the foundation of their truth. And as Elias looked at his partner and his child, he knew that the journey had been worth every painful step. He had found his way back from the distance he had made, and he was never going back. The world outside continued its frantic pace, but inside their home, time seemed to slow down. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were thriving. They were two people who had looked into the abyss of their own failures and decided to build something better. They were a testament to the power of the things we never say and the even greater power of finally saying them. Elias knew there would be more challenges. There would be more moments of fear and uncertainty. But he wasn't afraid of them anymore. He had the tools now. He had the language. And most importantly, he had the person who had taught him how to use them. He looked at Julian, who was now softly singing a lullaby to the baby, and he felt a profound sense of peace. The distance was gone. The silence was full. And the story that had begun with 41 unsent letters was finally being written in the only way that mattered, together. Every day was a new page, a new chance to be honest, a new opportunity to stay. And Elias, the man who had once been an expert at leaving, was now an expert at staying. He was the alpha who had learned to be a man, and the man who had learned how to love. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, he knew that the best parts of their story were still to come. The letters were the past, but the present was theirs. And for the first time in his life, Elias was exactly where he wanted to be. He thought about the box again, one last time. He realized that the letters weren't just for him. They were for Julian, too. They were Julian's way of keeping his own heart alive during the years of drought. They were a record of his strength, his dignity, and his capacity for love. Elias felt a deep sense of gratitude for those letters. They had saved him. They had brought him back to life. And he would spend the rest of his life making sure Julian never felt the need to write another one. "What are you smiling about?" Julian asked, looking up from the baby. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," Elias said. "You are lucky," Julian agreed with a wink. "But so am I." "I know," Elias said. "I know." And they did. They knew the cost of their happiness, and they knew its value. They were no longer the people they had been when the letters were written. They were stronger, wiser, and more deeply connected than they had ever been. The distance they had made was a memory, a scar that reminded them of where they had been and how far they had come. It was a part of them, but it no longer defined them. As the day unfolded, Elias found himself doing small things, the things Julian had once written about. He made the coffee and took it to Julian. He looked him in the eyes when they spoke. He touched his shoulder as he passed him in the kitchen. They were small gestures, but they were the language of staying. They were the words that didn't need to be written because they were being lived. And in the quiet moments, when the world felt too loud, Elias would remember the scent of the lavender and the taste of the warm soup. He would remember the mahogany box and the 41 letters. And he would hold Julian a little tighter, thankful for the distance that had finally brought them home. The story was no longer about what was lost. It was about what was found. And what they had found was each other, in the most honest, devastating, and beautiful way possible. The letters were the map, but the love was the destination. And they had finally arrived. Elias looked at his life and saw not a series of managed interactions, but a tapestry of shared experiences. There were threads of sorrow and threads of joy, threads of fear and threads of courage. And weaving through it all was the golden thread of their love, a love that had survived the silence and come out stronger on the other side. He was no longer afraid of the dark. He was no longer afraid of the messy, unpredictable nature of being human. He was just Elias, and he was with Julian. And that was more than enough. The mahogany box would stay in the closet, a quiet reminder of the journey they had taken. But the letters would live on in the way they looked at each other, in the way they spoke, and in the way they loved. As the evening shadows began to stretch across the floor, Elias sat down on the sofa next to Julian. They didn't need to talk. They just sat together, their shoulders touching, their presence a silent vow. The silence wasn't a wall anymore. It was a sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, they were safe. They were whole. They were home. Elias closed his eyes and breathed in the scent of his family. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever known. He thought about the man he used to be, the one who was so afraid of being hurt that he forgot how to live. He felt a flicker of pity for that man, but mostly he felt relief that he was gone. He was replaced by someone who knew that the only way to truly live is to be willing to be hurt. To be willing to stay. To be willing to say the things that are hard to say. He reached out and took Julian's hand, feeling the steady pulse in his wrist. It was a miracle. Life was a miracle. And he wasn't going to miss a single second of it. Not anymore. Not ever again. The distance was closed. The letters were read. And the rest of the story was theirs to write, together, one honest day at a time. He thought about the future, about the baby growing up, about the years of laughter and tears that lay ahead. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. He had the person he loved by his side, and he had the lessons of the past to guide him. He was a man who had found his heart in a mahogany box, and he was never going to let it go again. Julian leaned his head on Elias's shoulder, his breath warm against his neck. "You're doing it again," he whispered. "Doing what?" "Thinking too much. Just be here, Elias." Elias smiled and kissed the top of Julian's head. "I am here, Julian. I'm right here." And he was. For the first time in his life, Elias was exactly where he was supposed to be. And he wasn't going anywhere. The letters were the end of one story, but they were the beginning of a much better one. A story of a love that was no longer a secret, but a song. A song that would play for the rest of their lives, filling the silence with the most beautiful music Elias had ever heard. The music of staying. The music of being known. The music of home. As the night finally settled in, Elias felt a deep, abiding sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the mahogany box. Gratitude for the 41 letters. Gratitude for the Omega who had never stopped writing, even when the letters weren't sent. And most of all, gratitude for the love that had survived the distance he had made. It was a love that was quiet, and then suddenly devastating, in the best possible way. It was the love of his life. And he was finally, truly, ready to live it.